Our government has long recognized the right of conscientious objectors to be excluded from the waging of war, but we're all expected to pay for it come every April, no exceptions. Or are there? War tax resistance, ahead on Wide Angle. I don't recall any U.S. president or presidential hopeful ever publicly stating that it makes good sense, business or otherwise, to pay as little in taxes as possible until this past fall. With that example and tax day approaching, it seemed a good day to explore a more principled stand against taxes. Joining me to discuss war tax resistance are two guests. With me in studio is Mary Regan, a war tax resistor since 1983, and a board member of New England War Tax Resistance. And joining us from Wellesley via Skype is Professor Lawrence Rosenwald, editor of the anthology No More War, 3 Centuries of American Anti-War and Peace Writing, and director of the program in Peace and Justice Studies at Wellesley College. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me. Let's start simply, yeah? And just talk about what it is that war tax resistance is for people who are unfamiliar with it, and maybe why people would risk it. It sounds like it might come with some costs.
Well, war tax resistance is an action against war and militarism in which the participants withhold some or all of their federal taxes in opposition to war. So there's a variety of ways to do it, and people do it out of a sense of conscience. People who participate in war tax resistance are not all against taxation, but it's the use of our taxes for killing that is objectionable.
Right. One of our country's most famous war tax resistors, perhaps, hails from Massachusetts, yeah? Henry David Thoreau from mid-19th century Concord. How far back does a tradition resisting militarism and war in this country stretch?
It goes further back than Thoreau, actually. There's a wonderful undergraduate thesis from Goddard College by a woman named Barbara Andrews, trying to tell the whole history of tax resistance and war tax resistance in the United States. And she takes the story back to the middle of the 18th century, when Quakers like John Woolman and Anthony Benezet were considering the possibility of refusing to pay taxes to the colony of Pennsylvania, taxes they knew would be used for military expeditions. So it's older than the Revolution, this tradition.
Wow.
And the Algonquin indigenous people protested by withholding fees that they were being charged to pay for a fort, which obviously was not in their best interest to have a militarized fort.
Right. So colonial times even.
Yes.
It would be certainly my sense that people who are engaging in war tax resistance aren't withholding monies for personal reasons. That is to say, for personal gain, buying groceries and that sort of thing, yeah? And my sense is the answer is a variety of things, but what do war tax resistors do with the monies that they're withholding?
In addition to resisting war and militarism, we get to do something constructive with our money. So the money that I withhold from the federal government, I donate to organizations that are working for peace and justice. Also collectively, Larry and I are part of an organization that gives grants to groups, and some of my favorite groups that have benefited from our refused taxes include the Prison Birth Project that helps prisoners in Massachusetts jails have healthier births. And the Prison Birth Project recently, they were successful in a legislative effort to stop the shackling of women during labor. in Massachusetts. Also, we've supported the student immigrant movement. So all those dreamers out there working to build a life in America. We've worked for affordable housing groups, the Association of Haitian Women. So I feel really good about taking that money that would have gone to purposes that I can't abide by and giving it to organizations that are doing life-affirming work.
Could I just add, Mary and I have been essentially the Grants and Loans Committee for New England War Tax Resistance for the last 10 years. So we read the applications, rejoice at the energy they reflect, and get to give the interest on the fund away to these extraordinary people and the organizations they've created.
Now, it's interesting you bring that up, Larry, in terms of assessing risk, yeah? Insofar as I understand the notion of civil disobedience, and to a certain extent, yes, war tax resistance it could certainly be classified as civil resistance or disobedience. That the intention of the disobedience is to engender a response, yes, and to engage the other. So in this case, the U.S. government and policymakers, I assume, to engage their conscience and make them consider a moral issue, and to make them have to respond to that civil disobedience. Yes? Am I understanding it correctly?
Not for everybody.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Mary, why don't I take a shot at this? That's the wrong metaphor, but I'll take it. I'll make an attempt to formulate this, and you can kibitz. I would say that some war tax resistors are not focused on evoking a response from government. They are chiefly focused on keeping their money from being used by the government for military purposes. So they don't want to be found. They make themselves inconspicuous. They take jobs where their employers will not reveal them to the government. The goal is to keep the money from the military.
Gotcha.
For myself, the goal is exactly to evoke a response. So the way in which my wife, Cynthia Schwann, and I do war tax resistance is public. You might call it confrontatory. It is indeed illegal, and it is designed, as you suggest, to confront.
Yeah. Okay. Now, speaking of risk exposure, for viewers who were around Massachusetts area or attentive to the issue in the late 1980s, they might have heard of a couple out in western Massachusetts in the town of Coleraine who had their home seized in 1989. My sense is that that is an exceptional circumstance, and its purpose is to send a very clear message to the tax-resisting community that this is a possibility. But what are more likely risks that people who resist taxes on the basis of war are likely to come across, and maybe a sense of the range of consequences that the government sort of metes out to people?
Shall I give this a start? Usually, the first course of action is a letter from the IRS that says, you owe this money, pay up. If someone does not pay, that can be followed by an intention to levy and a lien, which would enable the government to take money from one's bank account. It can also happen that the IRS goes to one's employer and arranges for money to be deducted from wages. At any point in this process, from the initial resistance to collection, there are options for war tax resistors to negotiate, to pay, to do something else, to delay, to have more dialogue. So different war tax resistors will have more conversation with the IRS. Others will not engage.
Can I add,
Sure.
in the case of Randy Keeler and Betsy Corner in Coleraine,
Right.
what Randy and Betsy were doing as a matter of principle was giving away the money they had refused in taxes to the organizations they most admired. They had pretty much nothing in their bank account. They were in many ways deliberately uncollectible, which forced, led, encouraged, coerced the IRS in its pursuit of the money to seize the house, because the house was the asset that the IRS could identify. That was a strategy that in some way deliberately led to that outcome. I would say that what Mary describes is the more common sequence of events. And I would add that the risk of that is not only the seizing of the money, but psychologically the feeling of powerlessness, of not having control of one's own money, one's own paycheck, one's own bank account, the feeling of being alone. Often in recent years with the IRS, the feeling of never dealing with a human being because the letters are generated by the automated collection service. So it's you versus the government computers. It doesn't even feel like an encounter in some way. So psychological risks as well as financial ones.
Yes. I think when we talk about risk, yes, we as vortex resistors assume risks. Our credit ratings are bad, and it's hard for us to own property. But the other risk assessment is, what if we pay our taxes? What about the children being killed by drones? What about the militarization of our police forces? What about the devastation that both here and abroad of our money not going towards life-affirming efforts and instead towards militarism?
That's beautiful,
Yeah.
Mary. And I just want to add that every spring when Cynthia and I come to the question of refusing, we're weighing the disadvantages of war tax resistance, which are considerable, against the powerfully negative feeling that we would have if we paid the taxes, which is still more considerable.
Exactly.
As you said earlier, the way that people engage in war tax resistance varies by the individual, by the family. So, can you give us a sense? You said, some people will withhold their entire taxes. Some will withhold a portion. Certainly, there are more symbolic ways of acknowledging this and going about witnessing concern about war. What is give us a sense, if you can, of what the range of actions that people take who are in the community?
People might send a letter with their tax form saying, I don't want my money spent on war. They might withhold a symbolic amount of money, 1040, or a number associated with something that's happening in the military field. They might withhold a part of their federal taxes, and that's what I do. I in my work as a community organizer, am advocating for our government to spend more money on housing and health care and education. So I'm in favor of taxes. I want to pay taxes, but I just can't do it for killing. And there are people who live below the taxable income in order to not pay for war. And I'll throw the ball over to you, Larry, because I'm sure I'm forgetting something.
I think you've got pretty much everybody, actually. It might be interesting to say that some war tax resistors file and some don't. For some, opportunity to file is an opportunity to bear witness. For some, that the risk of filing is being collected on, and for them, the chief goal, as noted previously, is not to have their money go into the hands of the federal government.
Very good. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll ask people to join us on the other side, where we'll explore how we might build a tradition that respects the value and power of conscience. We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. And if you'd like to hear more about this or other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle. Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudez, speaking today with Mary Regan and Professor Lawrence Rosenwald about war tax resistance. All right, so here to me is the tough question, in the sense that I'm sure many people can imagine an issue of conscience that is important to them. For you, it's war and militarism. For other people, it might be abortion. It might be public schools. It might be building a border wall. The question are there moral criteria? Is there a way that we can look at a particular issue and register, you know what, as a society, we've made particular decisions about what we're going to fund, and there are some that we might not be foursquare behind, but we're going to underwrite it. We're going to pay for it. There are other issues, and obviously war and militarism is one for each of you, where that's a bridge too far. I can't, in good conscience, cross that line. How do we decide what those lines are for the multiplicity of Americans and points of view? Yeah, a sense of how to tackle that?
Maybe I'll start. So I can give you a technical answer, an almost legal answer. The government has a long history of acknowledging conscience as it bears on war and peace, as long as the tradition of conscientious objection to military service, which really begins with the Civil War in some particular cases. So we have an important precedent that says it's in the interest of government to recognize this manifestation of conscience. And it's not an illegitimate extension to say that government should also recognize the workings of conscience when people wish not only to serve in wars, but also to pay for them. That's the argument made by a remarkable tax lawyer named Marjorie Kornhauser in a work defending the legitimacy of a peace tax fund. And this is a great argument. My own personal argument is that I'm willing to live in a society in which people act according to their conscience on whatever issue conscience manifests itself for them. I was called once by a North Carolina pastor who'd heard of me through a clerk in a bookstore who'd been a student of mine. He came in asking for works about refusing taxes. He wanted to refuse them to pay to the government. He wanted to refuse paying taxes to a government that funded abortions. I thought we had something in common, this guy and I. We also had some things not so much in common. But I would be happy to live in a world in which people thought it was important to act in accord with their consciences as whenever conscience prompted them to act. Conscience doesn't prompt people to act that often, I should say. But I'll live in that world. I'll take the risks of that world. I think it might be healthier, more diverse, more flourishing, and more resistant than ours.
Yeah, I think it would be a healthier society. And I just, the example of abortion or public television, those are public policy issues like issues of war and peace in which people are working on a personal level to support or not to support, as well as on a public level. So we've seen public support for public television go down over the course of my lifetime. Right. We've seen the defunding of abortion, depending on who's president. So I think in addition to personal conscience, we're also looking collectively on each of those issues. How shall we spend our resources?
Right, right. I think conceivably another way to look at that, beyond an issue of conscience, is some widely respected documents such as the Nuremberg Principles, the UN Charter, the U.S. Constitution itself, which seem to have to point us in a direction that would support war tax resistance and the notion of conscience. Can you give us a sense, Larry, of how those documents sort of stake out that ground?
The document that's usually quoted is indeed the Nuremberg Principles. The United States is a signatory to some treaties and protocols incorporating those principles. So theoretically, the Nuremberg Principles are part of the law of the land. Mm-hmm. The Nuremberg Principles describe preparation for non-self-defense war as a crime against peace. For many war tax resistors, the size of the U.S. military budget, which at some points has been greater than the size of the rest of the world's military budgets combined, is itself a preparation for offensive war and therefore construable as a crime against peace. The stockpiling of weapons, in particular nuclear weapons, also comes under the Nuremberg Principles as being preparation for mass annihilation. This used to matter to me, I should say in candor, a lot more than it does now, and a lot more than it matters to most of the war tax resistors I know. Uh-huh. I mean, it's nice to be able to say that what we're doing is legal in the context of the principles, but most of the war tax resistors I know, even if there weren't such principles, would say, in my conscience, I cannot support the conduct of war. I will not pay money to support the conduct of war. I don't need an international treaty or a set of principles to warrant me in that.
Right, right. Good to situate it, however, for viewers in a broader context, yes?
Yeah, and if there's an interesting book by a man named Francis Anthony Boyle called Civil Disobedience and International Law that sets out, the relevant texts and their usual applications.
Okay. On a national level in this country, I gather that there is a congressional bill, H.R. 2377, entitled the Religious Freedom Tax Fund Act, that was filed in the last Congress. Can you tell us a little bit about it, and if it's going to be filed again in the current Congress?
It's been filed yearly for I don't know how long. Maybe you know, Larry.
At least 20, 25 years.
Yeah. Okay. And that law basically gives the same protection to war tax resistors who, out of religious conviction, are objecting to paying for war as conscientious objectors within the military have.
Okay. It suggests, the title suggests that there's a religious underpinning to this, but as I understand it, if it became law, it would be a law that would support a religious basis for objection, as well as a philosophical reasoning. Is that right?
That's right, and that's also true about conscientious objection itself.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Can I just say, I will take both of you to the nicest dinner imaginable if that bill ever gets passed.
Yes.
Yes.
Just to celebrate, but also to acknowledge the unlikeliness. It is indeed introduced year after year. It never comes out of committee. It's never voted on. Were it to be voted on, I'd bet it would be voted down. Because the power to draft, which is important to government, is not as important to government as the power to tax. And to challenge the power to tax is to challenge the most fundamental governmental power, at least as I understand it. So any challenge to it, to that power, seems unlikely to get governmental approval.
Yeah, my joy at the prospect of it passing was not so much about having dinner with you both, but it was about the sea change that would be.
Yes, of course, of course. A sense of resources that interested viewers could turn to for more information, websites, organizations, and the like?
The National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, nwtrcc.org, is a good resource on the variety of methods, potential consequences, who you can talk to in your area. The War Resisters League has information on resistance to war, including a pie chart that they put out each year showing how much of our budget goes towards the military, and that's warresister.org. And the Center for Defense Information, and that's cdi.org.
Very good. I want to thank you both for taking the time to join me today. Thank you also for the examples of your lives and directing us to how we might direct our own consciences to be in line with what it is we feel is important.
Thank you for inviting us and for asking wonderful questions.
Pleasure.
What Mary said.
Thank you, Larry. In a capitalist society, only stands to reason that voting with one's wallet will demand attention. Witness the state of California's threat to withhold funds destined for the federal government if the Trump administration cuts off its funding to the Golden State's sanctuary cities. But democracy has its demands as well, and conscience is one of them. Government, after all, should aspire to nurture citizens with strong moral compasses, rather than subdue their wills by law or threat or tweet. Is there not a sort of blood shed when the conscience is wounded, wrote Thoreau. Through this wound, a man's real manhood and immortality flow out, and he bleeds to an everlasting death. On behalf of Mary Regan and Lawrence Rosenwald, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.